Hi, my name is Kimiko Mar, and I am the chair of Tadaima 2021 this year. And I am really excited to introduce this book talk that we're going to have. It's about this book, The Never-Ending, The Friendships of Hampden Court. It's a really special book because it's actually about six different women wrote it, and it is about their families and their connection post World War II to today, which I think is kind of rare. So I really want to just dive right in. So I'm going to introduce our panelists. I'm going to bring everybody in. Hello, everybody.
Hi.
Hi.
Hello.
So let's just go ahead. I'll just have everybody introduce themselves, and I'll call on you so that we don't have the talking over thing. So Karen, let's start with you.
Okay. Hello, I'm Karen Amoto Yamasaki, and I am the senior editor of our book, and it's kind of by default because I am the oldest in the family, in the six families. I was actually born in camp at Hilo Relocation Center. My parents were already married. They were married in 1941 in June, and they ended up in camp in the next year in about April or so, 1942. And they were living in Santa Maria. My family lived there. My mother's family actually moved from Rocky Ford, Colorado, of her mother's health. She had a bad heart, and because of winters in Colorado, they decided to move to where my grandfather's brother was. And then in 1991, they got married. Then they ended up at WWII Assembly Center, and then they went on to Hilo Relocation Center. We left the camp around, I think, October of 1945, and we went to Chicago. And I think because my father's interest was in electronics, I think he figured out that there were more opportunities in Chicago. I know he applied or Zenith Electronics. So I think that was the main reason that they went there, besides the exclusionary area and so before 1940, before the war, there were like less than 100 people in Chicago, and after 1946, there were like over 20,000 Japanese Americans in Chicago. So we first moved to we settled. I think we had help from other people. We settled in an area called Clark and Division, which you may have heard of one way or the other, and then eventually moved to Hampden Court, and that was because my father's sister married Oguchi, whose parents owned a building, and so ended up there. And just that was a little bit of luck, but it was one of the best things that could have happened to us because we were in a community of Japanese people, Japanese Americans.
Hi, I'm Janet Klevenstein. I was born in Chicago. My parents were born in Los Angeles, Roy Teruta and Lily Mihara Teruta. They were introduced probably by their parents, actually, just at the end of the war, were married in Colorado and then moved together to Chicago, where I was born, as I say.
Oh, my name is Patsy Cohen, by the way, Patsy Shintani Cohen. And my father's mother became a widow very young. She had 5 young kids, and she moved them all from Washington State to Chicago. So my father's side of the family actually lived in Chicago before the war. They had a Japanese sukiyaki restaurant, unfortunately was closed when the war started. My mother's side of the family was like most of everyone else's families. She was born and raised in Pasadena and was incarcerated at Gila River and only stayed there for 4 months because she could not stand it. And as soon as she could, she got a job in Chicago, and that's where my parents met.
Okay, I am Donna Carita Tewart, and I was born in Chicago and currently living in California. And I'll come back to that. My parents, Hideko Teruta and Nobuo Carita, were born in California, and they met at the I'm drawing a blank for the name, the place that everybody was sent initially before going to camp. And they were at the Santa Ana racetrack, and that's where they met. They both were sent to Amachi. They were glad to do that because they sort of eyed each other during the when they were waiting to be assigned. They then went to Chicago, where they were married. I think there's three of us here that are rather unique, and that's Janet, Sandy, and myself are actually related. We're cousins. Whereas we're not really related to Karen, Gail, and Patsy, although I thought I was for many, many years. I was very surprised when I found out that they weren't my cousins or their parents weren't my aunts and uncles.
My name is Gail Razovich. I'm retired and I live in Evanston, Illinois. My parents are Anna Marie Miyamoto Nakamura, and my father is Mark Nakamura. Prior to the war, Mom and her two brothers were raised by a single parent because my grandfather, their father, died of appendicitis when he was only 42. So they were basically living in place in Los Angeles when they had to move to a place called the Olympic Hotel, which was owned by friends of my grandmother's in preparation for going to camp. As it turned out, one of the night clerks was my dad, who had emigrated to the United States with his younger brother and was working at the hotel and going to LA City College. So that's how they met. It ended up, they all went to Manzanar, and my parents eventually married in Manzanar in December of 44. How they ended up in Chicago is that one of my dad's best friends got out of camp early and moved to Chicago. And he wrote my dad and said that he thought there was less prejudice and a lot of employment opportunities. So that's why my parents picked Chicago. And when they got out of camp in December of 44, they moved to Chicago, and my mom's mom and her younger brother followed them.
My parents, my father, Todd Morimoto, my mother is Sachi Teruta Morimoto, and again, we are the Teruta family connects to Donna and my cousin Janet. Both of my parents were born on the West Coast. My father in Castroville, my mother in Gardena. And because of the war, they were removed from the West Coast and they were put in internment camps. My dad was at Poston, my mother at Amachi. And they didn't know each other. And when the opportunity to leave camp came up, I think my mother was the first of our Teruta family to leave, and she came to Chicago. And my father was probably the first in his family. He had 13 siblings, and he came to Chicago for the purpose of, he didn't want to return to the West Coast because of the prejudice. He felt it would be less prejudicial for him to be off of the West Coast. And like Gail said, there was more opportunity for employment, less prejudice. So that's why he came to Chicago. And they both met in Chicago, got married. I was born and raised in Chicago, but this group of women and the families and the connections we have, um, part of the theme of the book is the moai that we've created. And it's a very special connection, the support that's offered through these friendships. Um, and I'm just very thankful that this opportunity, I don't know who planted the idea that we should write this book because of the uniqueness of the longevity of the friendships and how the parents connected and all that. But I'm thankful that that seed was planted and we actually followed through. It took us a while to get here, but I have a higher appreciation for what I thought was just everybody always has these long-term connections, but that's not true. You know, this is a very different uh, relationship and friendship, and I'm thankful.
So Sandy, since you mentioned it, do you want to explain what moai is?
Uh, I'll let Karen do that.
Okay, Karen, you want to explain what moai is?
Moai is it's a practice, an Okinawan practice that I think Patsy found in an article, and it just kind of fit us. In Okinawa, five, I think five mothers decide that their daughters are going to be in a group that will support each other throughout their lives, financially, emotionally, everything. They'll be like, you're put into a group, and you stay with each other. And we picked on the idea and the concept, but for us, it wasn't something that was planned by our parents. It was something that just happened, organically. And because we were in Hampden Court, it started there, and it's continued. And the term is appropriate, but it isn't something that our parents planned. It's something that's happened, and we're all very grateful for it. And our book hopefully reflects this, in a unique way, uh, and in a way that is interesting and applies to any, regardless of whether they're Japanese American or not.
This is the cover of the book, and then who did the drawing? There's a drawing, I think, here.
The cover is a combination of two drawings, actually.
Oh.
If you go back to the cover, see the outline of the building.
Oh, I see here.
Well, yes, the outline of the building was done by Janet. She had a program that she could do the outline. It's based on the rotogravure that's on the next slide.
I see.
On the right.
Mm-hmm.
See, Janet did the outline, but the drawing and the detailed drawing of the entrance in the middle, which was this main entrance into the corridor, was done by my niece's husband, who is a professional artist, and Edwin Ushiro. And what he did was he took a photo. He made a drawing from a photo that I sent him, and this was it. And then we also repeated it on the next page, on opposite that. And so for the cover, I think we got the best of both worlds. We got a feeling of the building, actual building, and then we got a detailed drawing of the main entrance. Mm-hmm. And that's why I think it works so well on our cover.
The story behind our building, which is very unique and which helped create the friendships, was that it was a very unique building built by an entrepreneur who was a dance instructor. And behind the building was meant to house pied-à-terres, or little apartments, for his students and people who came to his soirees. In the back of the building which was a huge, ornate ballroom. By the time we got there, it was a rug cleaning company. And this building, as Karen mentioned, was owned by a Japanese American. And when our parents had difficulty finding housing that would accept them, they all gravitated towards buildings that were owned by Japanese Americans.
I wanted to ask, Patsy, you brought up an interesting point. I just wanted to ask all six of you, if you know, so did all of your parents have, when they came to Chicago, did all of them have problems finding housing because people did not want to rent to Japanese?
Just wanted to clarify that my family did not, in fact, live at Hampton Court. Um, we were elsewhere on the north side of Chicago, but in answer to your specific question, yes, I have heard my father, in trying to find us an apartment, explain that we are Japanese Americans, and he just brought that up quite clearly from the beginning. And I know that he was turned down on a couple of occasions on that basis.
Yeah, my parents found, through my dad's friend, found an apartment on the north side, but it was, it had, the first one they went into, they stayed one night, had cockroaches or bed bugs. And then the second one they found, the way they used to characterize it is that they left when the rats moved in. I know. And then, but the Hampden Court building, the couple that owned it, the Iguchis, that was the same couple that owned the Olympic Hotel in Little Tokyo, where my mom's family was living and where dad was working. And so it was through my grandmother's friendship with this couple that got us into Hampden Court. And we had a reason to leave, not necessarily because of prejudice, but it was kind of more of an opportunity because where they were living was not very good.
But other than the six families, did you ever go to any events, participate in any activities with other Japanese Americans, like Obon, or anything like that? Or were you kind of just a tight little group of your six families?
I'd like to answer that.
Go ahead, Donna.
I always had Japanese friends and Caucasian friends. And my parents made it a point that we went to all Japanese, or 99% Japanese attended church. And it wasn't in the neighborhood that I lived. And oftentimes my parents would not allow me to do something with my friends from school because I had to go to this Japanese, not only just the church, but sporting events. And Janet and I did do Obon every year for, I don't know, Janet, 3 or 4 years. So
I did too.
Again, wasn't a, oh, I'm sorry, Sandy, I didn't remember that. But Janet and I had to go to Midwest Buddhist Church, and we did that for many years. And I didn't want to do that, but had to, and wear a kimono and the whole bit. So I always had 2 sets of friends, and I could never understand that until I was older. I also think it's an interesting, and we've never really talked about it as a group, but the 6 sets of parents, or 12 people, produced, I can't remember, I think there's 15 children. And there is, I believe, only one that had married Japanese, and that's Karen. We all married Caucasian. And it's interesting that I'm not sure how that happened or why it happened.
My background is just so different because my grandmother lived with us, and she was with us when we went to Chicago. And I spoke only Japanese. until I went to kindergarten.
Really? Wow.
And my father was Kibe, which meant that he was born here and then was educated in Japan. And he didn't come back until he was like 17. So his first language was always Japanese. And he always stayed with people that only spoke Japanese. And so he didn't really start using English that much until we went to Chicago. And then he had to speak English, because of his work and all that. And so I've always been very aware that I'm Japanese American. And it has to do with having a grandmother that um, that spoke to me only in Japanese. And the funny thing is that I remember her telling me stories, and I would remember them as her speaking English to me, but she was speaking Japanese. Then the fact that we lived in Hampton Court, and then that I went to the church that four of the families went to that were active, and that was almost all Japanese American Christian church. And so and then I've stayed here, and I haven't really moved out to different places. And so I've always been very aware that I've been Japanese American. And then the fact that I was born in camp too, that kind of sets you apart. So for sure, where you were born and what some of your history is.
But our grandfather lived with us also, and I was sent to Japanese school. And most of the time I cut school and fought about going to school. So they finally said, okay, you don't have to go to Japanese school anymore. But because my grandfather lived with us, I was able to understand most everything that he said. And it wasn't until 1988 when I went to Japan for the first time with some of the people that are here and their parents that I realized that I'd like to learn a little bit more about being Japanese. So I made a point to apply for a job that worked in Asia. And that's how I learned a lot more and became quite proud to be Japanese American. But up until then, no way.
Unlike Karen, who identifies very strongly with being Japanese American, and I don't know if it's because of a the distance in my age, I really never thought about my heritage, my cultural background. I never identified with being Japanese American. My parents didn't speak Japanese at home. The only time I ever heard them speak Japanese is when my father called his father on New Year's Day in California to wish him Happy New Year's. I'd say, wow, he's speaking Japanese. This is like really weird. And I also did not live at Hampden Court like Janet. I lived in a building in Lincoln Park area. It was a 6 flat. And maybe because of my age difference, I didn't realize that there was housing was a difficult situation or whatever. But the building we lived in was owned by a Japanese American family, and there was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of the 6 units were in fact occupied by Japanese American families, and they became close friends, and I hung around with Japanese American people, but I didn't really think much about being Japanese American. It's just who that community was. I went to school, in grammar school in Lincoln and Lincoln Park area. It was, it was diverse. The whole neighborhood was diverse. We moved to Rogers Park, the north side of Chicago. Again, it was very diverse. I went to high school that was very ethnically diverse, and they were the first high school to do busing. So people from the south side, the east, the west side, all kinds of cultural impact influenced my life. I was also in the Drum and Bugle Corps, which was sponsored by the Nisei American Legion Post. And it was primarily many Japanese in it, but it was also an open door for other diverse cultures. We had Blacks, we had Puerto Ricans, we had Filipinos, we had Caucasians. And it was just my life. I never really thought about being Japanese American. It didn't dawn on me that that was an issue. And that's probably when I started to identify with it, is when I moved to California. There was such a strong, there's Japantown in San Francisco. There's just so many more people there that I finally did start to identify. It's like, oh, okay, so maybe I am, maybe I can relate to this some way, somehow.
I wanted to mention that my experience growing up was a little bit different, I think. My parents never told me about the camps. I found out in college. My experience growing up was kind of accepting it as, like, I think a lot of kids do, is this is normal. This is what growing up is like. So, okay, we went to an all Japanese congregational church that had its services in a rented Jewish temple. That was our life, and I had separate friends in school. However, there was kind of a melding. There were Boy Scouts at our church, and half of my friends in grammar school, the boys, were members of that Boy Scout troop. So for me, it kind of was a melding, a melting pot. It wasn't so much us versus them. But I think part of it was that I was very naive. In a way, my parents really tried to protect the three of us by not ever mentioning the camps or the negativity associated with the camps. I had a happy childhood because of that. It was only when I was in college that I was furious at my mom for never telling me about it. And even then, she couldn't talk about it. It was only much later that she was able to talk about it, and she actually wrote something about it.
Wow.
And it was only through that, what she wrote, that I was able to know just how angry she was. She never expressed it.
My experience was, again, a little bit different. As I say, both my parents were born in Los Angeles, the Los Angeles area, but they were sent to Japan for part of their education. And in fact, my father graduated from Waseda University in Tokyo, and my mother graduated from high school in Japan. I still have cousins in Japan because my mother had two older brothers who were sent to Japan as little boys to complete their education, because our grandparents assumed that, of course, they'd be moving back one day, and so they wanted their kids to be properly educated in the Japanese tradition. So the experience I had of the Japanese American community in Chicago was a little bit different, since both my parents were quite fluent in Japanese. And so we went to occasional Japanese language films. And I think many of us attended picnics of the Chicago Resettlers Committee that later became the Japanese American Service Organization. And as Donna mentioned, she and I and Sandy participated. We danced in our kimono in the Obon Festival, sponsored by the Midwest Buddhist Church, temple, really now. But apart from that, I mean, I grew up in what was, and to some extent still is, a Scandinavian neighborhood on the north side of Chicago. Now it's much more mixed. But my principal identity was not that of a Japanese American, because for one thing, there were relatively few other Asians in my neighborhood. So my family's connection with Christ Congregational Church was the principal. link, I guess, to the Japanese American community, in addition to, of course, the friendships of our families. But although I knew about the camp experience from earliest childhood, I don't remember having heard about it spoken, heard it spoken about with anger or bitterness. It was kind of with a wry kind of acceptance and, oh God, the joke was on us kind of thing. And in fact, it was not entirely a negative experience, but it was a learning experience. My mother's family moved involuntarily inland. They weren't incarcerated, but they moved to Colorado from California. And unfortunately, it was largely because of that, probably, that I never knew my maternal grandparents. They both died very young, having put to work, being put to work in the fields, which is something they never had done. And so they both died in their 40s. Um, but you know, even so, those war experiences, though I knew about them, were not something I'm glad to have known about it. My parents did not go into detail, of course, but again, it was just one of those things. It was a thing that you lived with and you got over and you got on with your life.
Right.
And it's possible that the reason that I knew more about it is because our grandfather lived with us and he did not enjoy being in camp. So he
Well,
often made reference. I mean, that's the only reason I understand Japanese too. But he would talk to me about how horrible it was to be put in camp. Grandpa Trude did not enjoy being in camp.
well,
Yeah, Karen.
You know, my parents, when I was growing up, whenever they met any other Japanese Americans, you know, for the first time, one of the first questions they would ask is, "What camp were you in?"
Mhm.
well,
And so that made, you know, kept me aware that there was this camp experience, you know, that was you know, mutual among most of the Japanese Americans, and I don't remember hearing anything, you know, that they it was like Janet was saying, it was something that they lived through. You know, it's past. There are these connections with other Japanese Americans, but that was like just something that you put up with, you endured. You know, it was gaman, and then you just continued on. One of the things though that happened when I was in eighth grade and in grammar school is my teacher. Um, she brought up the fact that the Japanese Americans were put into camp, you know, after the start of World War II. And that embarrassed me so much because she said it wasn't written in the history books, but this is what happened. And there I am, the only Japanese American student, and it was just very, very embarrassing. And that's why I'll probably always remember it. But she was right to bring it up, you know, and rather brave, actually.
Now, I did not know anything about the camps. You know, they didn't teach it in high school. When I lived in California, I made a point of always coming home for the holidays. And there was one year, I guess it was maybe in the late 70s, early 80s, or whatever. My mother and I were sitting at the kitchen table preparing dinner, little black and white TV on the table, and we're watching this movie, Return or Farewell to Manzanar. This was my introduction to the whole story about internment camps. And I said, Mom, that movie really sucks. And she said, because I thought it was a made for TV
Oh,
movie. I did not realize it was a historical event that actually happened. And so she looks at me and she says, Well, that's exactly what happened to my family and your father's family. We lost everything. We were removed from the West Coast. We were placed in temporary housing until they could build out all these different internment camps. And that's where we lived. And that was our life. And I thought, wow. And it astonishes me actually that even to this day there are so many people that don't even realize the internment camps ever happened because there's so little. I mean, there's a lot more information about it now, but how many years later are we right now that it's taken this long for this chapter in history to become more common knowledge? And the first time that I ever experienced kind of hostility to being Japanese, I lived in California at the time. I was out shopping at a store, and it was the 50th anniversary of like World War II. I'm standing at the store, minding my own business, shopping. Two Caucasian ladies come up, one on each side of me, whispers in my ear, "Remember Pearl Harbor." I was flabbergasted. My mouth dropped. I said, "Why are you saying this to me? I wasn't even born. What is your problem?" And I just did a 180 and walked out of the store. I was just flabbergasted by that. And that was, like I say, the 50th anniversary of World War II. I wasn't even alive. Why are you spewing your vile at me, So.
And I never went, I stopped going to school on December 7th in high school. Actually, I started it in grammar school. And there were days when Grandpa and I would have these huge arguments that he wanted me to go to school and I wouldn't go. And we would fight.
Oh, really?
Yep.
Wow. Now, what was his rationale that he wanted you to go because
I should be proud and I shouldn't let this bother me. And I was born in this country and my parents were born in this country, so I should go to school. And I would tell him that I know I'm going to get, somebody's going to say something mean, or there's going to be a Japanese flag brought to school, or because people were confused, they would pull their eyes and say, "Ching Chong, Chinaman." And I just did not want to go. And he would, some years I can remember, he'd take me by the arm and we'd walk to school and he'd say, "You're going in this door."
Wow.
And then what happened? You went out the back?
No, I would stay in school, and then when I'd come home and he'd ask me how my day was, and some days it was good, and back then we came home for lunch. So I'd come home for lunch, and he'd say, "Now we're not going to argue. You're going back to school." And I said, "Yeah, I'm going back." But that took a long time before I went to school on December 7th in high school.
Well, I have the honor or dubious honor of having been the first baby born in Chicago on DJ Day. And so the newspapers wanted to take my photo because of it. And my grandmother nixed that. But I did want to I have a short grass is always greener comment to everyone saying how, like Donna, for example, not wanting to do obon or, mixing with Japanese. I used to be so jealous of all of you for not only just being able to learn these dances and learn about the culture, but primarily meeting Japanese boys. Because growing up, and you had a few cute ones, I tried to see it. But as far as finding out about camp, I would say my parents never talked about it. And only spoke English at home because they wanted us to assimilate as and so not have any hint of an accent, to seem very American. But it wasn't until the reparation letter came that my father finally said, "It's about time." And and after that, my mom was pretty open about talking about what happened in camp, but up until then, they never talked about it.
Oh.
And I think that's pretty standard of all of the Nisei people. They just didn't talk about it.
It's the guilt and the shame of
Yeah,
Karen.
The other thing too is that I never asked or never really questioned them. And I could have, because I remember my mother and my father did say things about camp, but it was one of those, like my father was a cook in camp and he didn't know how to cook. And he said that he got the same pay as a doctor. And then my mother learned these different things like drafting in camp, and she also made these beautiful little realistic wooden pins of birds and painted them and all that. And it was just bits and pieces here and there, and never a whole story. But then I was thinking I could have asked at some point. So part of the blame is, I feel on me for not being inquisitive, asking. But it was something that in my case, it was just so accepted that it was just a part of your family history, and then you really didn't need to know more details about.
Yeah.
The other thing had happened in our family is my mother died when she was very young, so my father remarried, and he remarried a woman who was very much against camp and was very vocal. And I think part of it was she had a brother who was a no-no boy. So we heard a little bit about that. But also, and Gail was at the dinner table one day when my father, and this was in the, I don't remember, the 90s or the early 2000s, and we were having dinner, and he said, my time in camp was probably some of the best years of my life. And Gail's mother was also at the dinner, and we all looked at him and said, what? And he explained that at the time that he was in camp, he didn't realize the effect that it had on his parents and losing everything. Yeah. And for him, he didn't have any responsibilities. There was always somebody to play with. He was big in sports, and he was on the baseball team and the basketball team, and he got to play cards, and he went to dances, and it was wonderful. And we were just shocked when he said that. But, and it was so different than his current wife, who very much still hated the whole process. And I think it was because of her brother.
Have any of you been to the campsites that your family was in? And how was that?
I can't remember how many years ago. It wasn't that long ago, but and not because I wanted to go, but we went with a couple from California, and we went birding in Arizona, and they were going to drive. We flew there and met them, and then they were going to drive back, so we just hitched a ride with them, and we were going to go past Gila, the incarceration campsite. And because the husband was born there, and he was like born in 1945, and his family was one of the last families to leave. And Gila had two camps, Butte Camp and Canal Camp, and his family was in Canal Camp, and we were in Butte. And so I was kind of like, okay, if you want to, I'll since we're in the car already, I was just a little curious. And then when one of the reasons he wanted to stop there too is that he had a friend who wanted to visit the site, but went online or something to the government and was told you'd have to pay $200 in order to get a permit to go to the camp. And so he didn't want to pay. And then I guess he talked to somebody else, and that person told him, you can just drive on to the site. Just get directions from somebody in the town, and you can just drive there. It's part of the Indian reservation. And so that's what we did. We went into the town, talked to somebody who actually remembered the camp. And he said they used to call it the Jap camp. He gave us directions, and you go down these roads, and there were they were growing almond trees in one area, because that's where they were getting money, from the nuts. And then so we drove. We found the spot, and there's no museum or anything there. You saw all the foundation or whatever was things that were left there. Things were on the ground that were there from the time there were people there. So we picked up a few things and took them back as souvenirs. But then on the hill, there's this which was there before, was a memorial to the soldiers, Japanese American soldiers that had died during the war, and that was still there. It had been refurbished. It looked better than I think it had in the past. There was in the distance there was a water tower that was there when the camp was there, and otherwise it was just kind of strange to walk there and realize that your parents may have walked the same path, because there is a picture of my mother and me up on that hill, and my grandmother too. There's one picture of the three of us, and with that monument in the back, and then to just look around and you had to be careful of the rattlesnakes. You didn't want to go near the bushes because the rattlesnakes were there during the day, and just to see what was left. And this was the foundation for the gym or something, and it meant later on it meant more to me than it had before going there, that I actually saw this place, and so I was glad that we stopped there, and I wouldn't have otherwise gone out of my way to go to it. So it's because I was born there too. But if you do have a chance to go to the campsite of your parents, I think it's worthwhile. It's just a different feeling that that part of your history is there, and maybe you should kind of maybe honor it that way, be aware of it.
We've been to Manzanar several times, actually, and starting when it was just the tower and the cemetery memorial, to when it really started developing as more as a museum, almost the whole place being a museum. But the best time was the first time we went with my mom. And it was before anything was really pointed out or identified, but she kind of roughly showed us where her barrack was, where the church she got married was, where the hospital where she worked was. So that made it really special. And then she would tell us stories about it. And then the last trip was with my youngest sister and her husband and two children who were still in grade school. And that was really nice and wonderful to hear the stories from their grandmother. So I would say those were the why it was worthwhile and why I'm really glad we did it. Plus the local museum actually is in its display one of the bridesmaid bouquets that were made for her wedding, and a picture of her when she was working in the hospital. Oh. She was a receptionist. So
I never went to any of the camps. However, my nephew, who I came to become guardian of after my sister passed, he had a good interest in history. And the Chicago chapter of Japanese Americans, the JACL, has a program of sponsoring, or you apply to be sponsored on a trip to Manzanar and to learn about the Japanese experience. And so I said, why don't you try to apply for that? And so he submitted an application and he was accepted, and he flew out to Los Angeles with maybe a half a dozen or about a dozen people, And they learned about the experience of Manzanar. And the interesting thing is that the Nakamura family that's where Gail's mom was and her father. And, she's still alive. So when he returned from this experience, we were able to get together, have a luncheon, and the two of them could share their feelings about the experience. And so the next generation, of which he is, is has been exposed to it, has learned about it, and I think it's definitely worthwhile. I could not answer any questions for him. Both of my parents were passed away and couldn't give him information about the camp experience. I was not curious enough as a young teenager or a young adult. I was so into myself and exploring who I am that I never questioned or thought to ask about my parents and what their life was like as a young adult, blah blah blah. um, so because I knew he was interested in history, um, I'm glad I presented the opportunity to him so that he had a chance to learn directly from um, people that know, that can share the true experience with him.
I think we'll all admit that we are all part of that Sansei effect. We all have a little bit or a lot of that need to be perfect. And that's it. It's been, in a way, a struggle for us because we all want this. We wanted this product, our book, to be perfect. And it won't be.
I applaud you all for doing it, and I really hope that other people take a cue from what you did and kind of try to write something of their own, whether or not it's fiction like Alden did, or if it's biographical, or even I kind of consider your book more as like almost like a scrapbook of Hampton Court. It like has the history, but it has all the different photos in it. So
it started out as a photo album. That's what it was going to be. Looking through old boxes of old photos and putting them together, and then maybe captions and a little text here and there. And it just got bigger and bigger the more we got into it. And it was what it's turned out to be is like a memoir. It's a history book, Hampton Court, and it's also a genealogy study too. And then we have our photo album, and it's gone through a couple of different titles, and I think the never ending is very true in our case. It's for us. There's not going to be an end to the friendships. It's going to continue on into the next generation and continue on as long as the New Year's get-togethers continue. I was going to say that working on our book, and I was thinking about this before our discussion, is that we all have these bits and pieces of history, of our family history, given to us by our parents, or you heard this or you heard that. And until you write it down or produce a book like this, you don't know how they all relate to each other. You're taking all the stuff that you may have known for a long time, and you put it down, and then you realize there are all these holes in what you don't know, and then you try to connect them, and you go to all different sources, and then you see these old photos, and then you start putting it together, and then you realize that this is a whole story. What you knew before was only little bits of it. And now you have a whole story, you have a family history. And that's what's been so great about working on this book, that we have 6 family histories now that, regardless of what happens from now on, they're there in the book. and hopefully it's accurate. That was our one problem. How accurate are these dates and things?
What advice would you give? And I'll call on each of you to a Japanese American person, whether or not they're Nisei, Sansei, Yonsei, who is interested or contemplating publishing a book about their family's experience. So we'll start with Karen. What's your advice?
I think it's really worthwhile. Like I said before, about having these bits and pieces of your family history you know about, but you haven't organized it. Once you start writing something about your family, you get to realize that their story is a whole story, and you only know pieces of it. So once you start putting it down, that it makes more sense. You see the ebb and flow of the history. The other thing is that you should get other people to help you, because there'll be all kinds of questions that come up that you may not know the answers to yourself, or how to get it, or advice. And the other thing too is that it's going to take a lot longer than you think.
You think?
We started off. It took us 3 years to do this. I mean, we only got the books in the beginning of June. But it's 6 of us, so it's 6 different stories, and for us, I think it worked out really well, because everybody contributed. They contributed, not the same information, but different viewpoints and different ideas. Like our cover is in black, red, and white, mainly because of Sandy's different suggestions for graphics throughout the book. The other thing was, the main thing was that it's going to take longer. Oh, the other thing is too is I have to give credit to my husband, because he has just a little bit.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
Because
Dick the rock star.
because he had worked through a printing company called Blurb, making picture books, photo albums, and all that, and they were mostly photos. And so we had his expertise to start with, and then we had a company that he used, and so we asked a lot of him, because we went from just pictures, just photos, pictures, to text, and then different. We made changes here and there, and so things got moved, and pictures got replaced, and there were sometimes a few arguments about the organization of the book, and we got through those, and then when we got it all together, it turned out to be 155 pages. When we started off, I thought it was going to be like maybe 50 pages or so, but 155 pages this is. And then with a cover, and then there's all these different steps you had to do, and then we got it all together, and then Janet went through the editing of it to make sure we had no typos or misinformation, and it's been quite a process. And then the other thing too is that we made it look like a book. We first were going to just put in, just maybe a title, and then start off with the pictures. And then as the further we got, the more book-like it became, with a title page, dedication page, and contents, and all that, and then page numbers, and then we have in the back we have what is it, the
appendix.
The appendix, yes, thank you, the appendix. And because some pictures, there are a group of people in there, and their names we couldn't, there isn't enough room to put all their names, so we refer people to the appendix, and there you see the names and all that. So I think it's a very complete book, and I don't think we would make any changes to this now. So
Okay.
so
So Janet, what advice would you give to somebody who would want to kind of put pen to paper on their own family?
I really would encourage others to write their family histories. Seek the reminiscences, especially of your seniors, and write them down or record them, or get them in some form that can be capture all the information you can, while those who are familiar with your family histories are available to provide it. Note down the background of family heirlooms as well, and in as much detail as possible. Attach Post-its to the back of photos with as much detail as you can, the names and dates, because that's something, I mean, we all have drawers full of photos. We don't know who they are because we don't have anybody to ask anymore, unfortunately. The book took, as Karen said, 3 years to produce, from first draft to hard copy publications. And during the production, several of the authors dealt with health challenges, rather serious ones, to themselves and family members, but they soldiered on. The spouses and siblings of the authors provided significant help, notably with computer issues and research into family history. And I too would like to give a special shout out to not only John Tewart, but also to Dick Yamasaki, who did the heroic job of formatting the entire book and submitting the finished PDF for printing. It was really a labor of love, and everybody pitched in.
I'm actually not working, but talking to another Sansei who lives here in Sun City.
No.
And as a result of seeing our book, she wants to do something similar. So we've talked a little, and some of the notes that I've made to have a conversation with her is similar to what Janet said about get down as much information as you can from those that, I think Karen said the same thing about those family members who are still around. And I told her, no matter how small a subject is, learn about it. Meaning somebody might say something about a hobby of theirs and you didn't know about it, explore that. I said, don't try to, if you get onto a topic, don't try to do the whole topic until it's finished. Just gather information, gather as much as you can from as many people as you can. Include every member of your family, even people that you either have had difficulty with or don't think that they have much to contribute, or no matter their age. I said, make sure you include everybody. Similar to what Janet said about the photos. Start to write down the photos of people that you know who they were and the year that maybe the photo was taken. And she has started working with her mother. And like I said, she's a Sansei, so her mother is a younger Nisei than my parents, but not by much. They're in their 80s. So I'm hoping that she gets this done. She's pretty excited.
A little bit different. I would say don't think if you are planning to do a family history that it has to be the equivalent of James Michener's Hawaii.
Yeah.
That you could try to somehow narrow the topic to something that is either of interest to you or something that you think you could manage. Now, I wanted to bring up that my mom's cousin, Sam Mahara, who goes on the speaking tour about Heart Mountain.
You're related to Sam?
Yeah, he's my mom's first cousin. And that's why I brought him up, because I know people know who he is. And after he retired, he was looking for something to do. And one of the things he always wanted to do was to talk about that story. And, you know, he not only did such a great job of it, but he also made it relevant to what's going on in the world. And I think that if you maybe sometimes just look at a piece of your story. Maybe you had like Shirley Ann Higuchi, who started out with her mom, and then kind of that got bigger. Or you could start with another event like Pearl Harbor or emigrating to the US. But everyone's got maybe at least a piece of their family history that might be easier for them to start with. And then from there, it could grow. But, don't think you've got to get it all down at one time. Starting out small, I think, is really good. And relying on your family, asking your family to help you, because there's probably interest among your family to help you do the research. Because boy, I couldn't have done it by myself. If I didn't have a younger sister who was big into genealogy, I would have had a lot harder time of it. And I know she's helped a few other people in the group with that. So that would be my advice.
Okay, great. Sandy?
I would encourage the documentation of the history as much as you can get. Unfortunately, I have a regret that I wasn't curious enough about my parents and asking the questions before they passed away. So it was actually very difficult for my participation in this book, because there's so few people for me to call upon about the history of the Morimotos. The Terutas, I've got Donna and I've got Janet. The Morimoto side, although my dad had 13 siblings, there's really only 1, 2, 3, 4 of them left alive. And they were so young that two of them weren't, one of them wasn't even born during the concentration period. And then the youngest one he was a toddler. And then there's my Auntie Kiki, who gave me pretty much the information I included in the book. And she gave me the information about where my grandpa came from and where my grandmother was and how they met. And so the detail about the Morimoto history comes from her. But, had I asked this question years ago or was curious enough I had 13 aunts and uncles that I could have asked, but I didn't, so there's that whole huge chunk of history that I wasn't able to glean and share. But so I would encourage people that if you've got relatives around, that you document it, and whether you include it in the book or not, at least document it, and so that you have the history available. But I would encourage writing a book. It was painful, but we got through it.
Okay. 2 examples that I can give that show that no matter how small you think an item is or whatever, it's worth asking. In 2000, was it 2000? I asked Mrs. Hanamoto about just the outlines of our building. What did the rooms look like? What was the floor plan like? She wound up writing this amazing document. She drew the floor plan of the entire first floor of Hampton Court. She wrote down the names of every single tenant in each of the apartments. And I didn't do anything with that, but it became, so important to our book. And the other experience I've had is just handing a recorder to my uncle. I went down to Texas and I said, we're going to buy a recorder and I'm going to ask you everything you know about your life, your growing up, my parents, your experience in the war. And I found him one night. I got up to go to the bathroom and there he was talking into the recorder. He was
great.
So happy to share all that. So I transcribed it, and our family now has a much better idea of the background of the Nisei.
One example of the questions I'd like to insert is that's how we found out that Sandy's parents met through a blind date. You know, my father, when he turned 80, I put together a jar and I put 80 questions in there, trying to get something similar to what Patsy got from her uncle. That if he answered those 80 questions, I'd learn about him from childhood right through marrying my mother. And it was through that we learned, as I said, that Sandy's parents met through a blind date from somebody who was working in a glove factory. We would have never known that had he not answered that question.
I just wanted to say or add a little bit more to what Patsy said about the about asking my mother about the layout of Hampton Court, and then she also got the names of the people there. Like I asked my daughter, you know, her reaction to the book, and that was her favorite part of the book. The fact that she saw my mother had gone to the trouble of putting together this layout. And when you think about it, this was like 2000, and we left Hampton Court in 1953. So she's just drawing on her memories, or maybe she wrote it down somewhere. And then all the names of the people that that lived in the apartment. She and my father were the managers, but still like to remember all those names, like maybe they were all there in her memory, and then it was a good way to get them out. And then the other thing I wanted to say was, I just want to read my daughter's comment. She said, the letter is a classic of who she was, and always so helpful and kind to others. The letter from Mrs. Nakamura, too, with her own words, is also a comfort and joy because she and Grandma shared so much of their lives together. So this is what reading this book was to my daughter. And so, you know, there's another generation that has this. Oh, and then the other thing too is that my granddaughters, she's told me they got a kick out of seeing me as a little girl. And then they saw pictures of their great grandmother, who they really didn't know. And then the other thing too was they got a kick out of seeing their names in the book. When you think
Another
about
family tree.
Yeah, little kids just don't see their names in an actual book. You know, and there it is, preserved for the rest of your life.
Yeah, there was one other thing, and it relates to Alden's book, which was fiction, but it wasn't just about being, I think for him, Japanese American, but also being gay, that someone doesn't even have to write about family history. They can write about what it means to be Japanese American, or a yonsei or a hapa. I mean, I'm currently reading a young adult book called From Little Tokyo with Love, which is about a young hapa teenager who is living in Little Tokyo and what she's going through, not knowing who her parents are. She thought she lost them when she was young. And, I was kind of thinking being a fourth generation must be great because you don't have to worry about, am I Japanese, am I American, am I, Filipino, whatever. But actually they do. I mean, they are having experiences that are different from us that is worthwhile also recording. So I guess my advice would be, it isn't always about family history. It's about how you see yourself. And, maybe your family history plays into that, but it might be important for you just to say, this is what happened to me. So,
okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you. Goodbye, everybody.